Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erika.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, and stream us on Spotify and YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok too. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we have an episode today that you and I are both so excited to do. You've been wanting to do this episode for years.
Oh, yeah. I'm so excited. Just delighted. But for real, this is one that you've been talking about doing since we started this podcast. The day has finally come.
The day has finally come. And I let you off the hook for this one because it's quite nerdy.
It's a little out of my realm. So I'm very glad that you found some like-minded individuals to come on and have a great chat with.
So here's what we're talking about today. This month, two behemoths of British culture crash into one another when the new season of Doctor Who featured a much-anticipated Beatles episode called The Devil's Chord. Doctor Who fans have been hoping for a crossover like this for years. And the promo pictures, which many of you probably saw, showing the Beatles were a source of many an internet comment, and maybe not for the reasons BBC and Disney Plus were hoping for. It was quite weird.
Yeah, a little bit.
So I'm joined today by Jim Ryan and Chen. They are two friends in the Beatles community who both have one foot solidly planted in both the Beatles and the Doctor Who fandoms, giving us an excuse to nerd out over these two worlds colliding. With their love of Doctor Who, the Beatles, and alternate history stories, there are few people more qualified to talk about this topic.
Jim Ryan is the author of the novels Raging Gale and Red Jenny and the Pirates of Buffalo, as well as the popular history The Pirates of New York, and short stories in numerous anthologies. He writes, and he has written for a very long time, the Fantasia Obscura column for Forces of Geek, which he originated on our home base back in the day, Rebeat magazine. Jim is a lifelong Beatles fan, and his alternate history stories of the Beatles have been published in a collection called Alt Together Now, which is like the best title I've ever heard in my life.
So good.
It's so appropriate. I love it. And Chen, you might know, is the co-creator and co-host of the When They Was Fab and the Toppermost of the Poppermost podcasts. He tells us that somewhere buried in his deep, dark past is a Beatles/Doctor Who fanfic where he Mary Sued himself and his friends into the companion roles. Love a good Mary Sue. Yeah. We've all been there with our fanfic.
Of course. So we've got some experts on this conversation today, and we will be talking about just some of the many connections between the Beatles and Doctor Who, including their shared timeline, actors who played both Doctors and Beatles, and the many Beatles references over Doctor Who's 60-year history. We'll also recap the Beatles-specific parts of the Doctor Who Beatles episode, The Devil's Chord. So we've kept this episode focused on the Beatles-related elements of both the history and the Doctor Who episode. And of course, we'll be discussing spoilers and major plot points for The Devil's Chord in this episode. Even if you don't care for Doctor Who, I would say give this episode a shot, if for nothing else than seeing the guy who plays George Martin and, of course, the fabulous Jinkx Monsoon as the villain.
I must concur. I'm not a Doctor Who fan, but I enjoyed the episode. I thought it was delightful. I thought seeing not only the guy who plays George Martin, but there's another special cameo that I really liked that we'll talk about in a second.
Hell yeah.
But yeah, Jinkx Monsoon was pretty fantastic too.
But if you want more Doctor Who that we're giving you here, the When They Was Fab podcast, which is Ed's podcast, has an extended cut of this conversation with a much deeper dive into the Doctor Who side of things. We'll drop that link in the show notes. And one last thing, there were a few sound issues on this recording. We did the best we can to edit them out. And now, the Beatles and Doctor Who.
For over a year, we have been anticipating the, quote, Beatles episode of Doctor Who, unquote, and it finally dropped last week with The Devil's Chord.
Jim and I have been talking about doing this Beatles Doctor Who crossover for many, many years.
It took us 3 generations, but finally we got to it.
So we will get back to the episode towards the latter part of this discussion, but since this is a Beatles show, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce some of the connections between the Beatles and Doctor Who, and there are many more than we might have guessed.
And for those of you who don't really have a background in Doctor Who, we'll give the very, very short background on what the show is and what the history is. I know that a lot of American fans actually didn't even experience it until the 70s. It didn't start coming on US TV, I think, until 1972. So some of this earlier stuff probably isn't known to people who didn't watch it or don't watch it now.
Yeah.
I think what most people know of Doctor Who, at least before the modern era, is, oh, it's that show about that guy who travels in a phone box and has a long scarf.
Doctor Who, of course, is a British science fiction franchise, began as a BBC television show in November of 1963. As we said, the Doctor is a member of a species called the Time Lords. He looks human. He's not human. He travels through time and space. He has adventures, saving the universe, and especially Earth and especially Britain along the way.
Both he and the Beatles have ties to November of 1963.
Yes. The first episode, An Unearthly Child, aired the same weekend that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the U.S., and it was also at that time when Beatlemania was actually coming to its fore. If you were growing up in England in the 60s, you can't really say that you didn't pay attention to both of them because they were both pretty well intertwined and were so popular throughout that.
And even though the Doctor travels the entirety of time and space, he always spends a good amount of his time in whatever the modern era was at the time of filming. So since the first Doctor's adventures began in 1963, the Beatles became something of a cultural touchpoint in the series.
He has visited 1963 several times before, and toward the end of the first Doctor, we had a companion named Vicky from the 25th century who would tell us the Beatles are recognized as classical music in the 25th century. In 1965, the Beatles were just on the verge of help. I found it amazing that the writers had enough foresight to say, oh yeah, not only are they going to last, they are going to have a museum dedicated to them in Liverpool. And of course, nowadays, there is indeed a Beatles museum. Yep.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Sometimes your favorite science fiction show does make a good call back in the past. So,
yeah, I think they made a good call there. I think, though, Brian made a very good call, pulling it back just a little bit. There was supposed to be an actual Beatles Doctor Who crossover.
This was the same episode. The Chase is the name of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We're going to see them playing at the Festival of Ghana in 1996. I think the BBC had also said, let's have them do a 50th anniversary concert wearing gray beards and being quote unquote old men. Brian nixed that because he thought that wouldn't be so good for the Beatles' image. You know, maybe that would have been very strange today to watch the Beatles' 50th anniversary intact.
Speaking of images, we have a moment to go into particulars about the chase and how stuff in that episode affects people who are looking for older Beatles material.
I think this is one of the most interesting and significant points of Doctor Who and Beatles crossover, actually.
The BBC was very bad about maintaining both video and audio tapes. A fair bit of Beatles history no longer exists because the BBC just went and junked it. Oh, who's going to want to watch a pop band from the 60s 10, 20, 30 years from now? And so, okay, we'll throw it into the fire.
In all fairness, deaccessioning is a great strategy to use if you don't intend to build out your library. And it was only after people started coming back to say, well, you have this that we can make money off of it, at which point they went, uh-oh.
Fortunately, copies got sent to overseas outlets of the BBC, and a significant number have found their way back, both Beatles and Doctor Who.
The interesting connection here is that there is a scene where we do see the Beatles perform in the chase, and the top of the pops from which that clip was taken from has been wiped. This is the only piece of that episode that they have, and it's incorporated in the other show.
BBC One. Our next program is due to start in just under 1 minute.
Vicky, what year have you got on there? 1965?
Come on, come.
You've got a television? Show it. I want to watch it.
Now, ladies, number one hit is the fabulous quick question. It's the fabulous Beatles.
That clip of Ticket to Ride is not available on the US version of the DVD because of rights. So if you go and buy the DVD or the Blu-ray here of The Chase, you're not going to find that clip, but it does indeed exist. It is in the British copies of the videos. And actually, not too long ago, there was a special on the Beatles on the BBC as part of the Now and Then promotion, and they did play the entire clip.
So let's talk a little bit more about the connections.
Ed, you mentioned a couple of things, such as Paperback Writer showing up in The Evil of the Daleks, which people didn't realize, for large part because the episode had been wiped amongst the other deaccessionings. And, of course, Remembrance of the Daleks having both Do You Want to Know a Secret and Taste of Honey on the radio in the background.
That's so interesting because the whole premise of the Doctor Who episode that we saw this month was built on the fact that getting the rights to the Beatles is so expensive. So they built a whole story that required that they weren't doing Beatles songs. But back then, they could just put them on in the background.
Remembrance features the Beatles versions of Beatles songs. You never get away with that today.
In addition to the songs, you also have a lot of touch back and forth. There's a great scene in The Three Doctors.
The Three Doctors is a series from 1973 and features a fun Doctor Who trope where the current actor playing the Doctor is joined by past Doctors to solve a problem together with their separate selves. It's usually done for special episodes like anniversaries or sometimes regeneration episodes where one actor is leaving the role and another actor is entering the role. Having multiple doctors together in the same space often requires a lot of explanation to the current humans the Doctor is traveling with.
John Pertwee's Doctor and Patrick Troughton's Doctor are trying to explain regeneration to a companion, and we get a clip that actually plays off the I Am the Walrus lyrics.
You see, Joe, he is one of me.
Oh, I see. You're both Time Lords.
Well, quite. Well, not quite.
Oh.
Not just Time Lords. We're the same Time Lord.
Now, please, you're only confusing my assistant. Joe, it's all quite simple. I am he, and he is me.
And we are all together, Gookie Choo?
What?
It's a song by the Beatles.
Oh, how does it go?
Oh, please be quiet.
As they moved on to the second Doctor, one of his defining characteristics was, he had a Beatle haircut, which he did.
Yeah, that's true. You did.
Here Comes the Sun was mentioned in what is derisively referred to by some as New Who in the episode 42.
And that episode was from 2007 with David Tennant as the 10th Doctor and companion Martha Jones.
And it even continues on well beyond that. At the beginning of the episode Spyfall, during Jodie Whittaker's time, Yaz, one of the companions, her father is trying to play around with an Alexa-like device, and he asks the device, play Rubber Soul. And the device keeps telling the poor man where a cobbler is within 1 kilometer of his location.
My favorite modern day Beatles tie-in was from 2015, where the promo image for the season featured the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi, and his companion Clara walking across Abbey Road with a couple of Daleks. I don't know why this was the promo image. There were no other Beatles connections that season.
I heard an interesting story when that picture came out. There was a dedicated Beatles fan who saw the picture, and they knew a Whovian. And the Beatles fan said, hey, did you notice? Clara's barefoot. Clara's barefoot? Oh, yeah. And it's because, and he went into about a 30-minute spiel about Billy Shears and the whole, and when he finishes up the whole thing, he goes, don't you see? They're telling us that Clara's going to die. And the Whovian turns around and goes, and?
And of course she did, sort of.
She did.
By that time, she was on her, 8th encounter with the Reaper? I mean, the reason they called her the Impossible Girl is that every time she'd appear, she'd meet an untimely end, but here she is again in a totally different time and place. So you say Clara's going to die, and somebody's going to go, hasn't she died more times than Kenny in South Park by now?
Sort of vaguely related to that, in 1965, John and Cynthia were at Cannes, and a Dalek came trundling up. So you will find photos of John completely ignoring a Dalek in the background.
Well, there's a good reason for that, actually. It was the same year that 2 films at Cannes were looking for international distributors. One was Help, and the other was Doctor Who and the Daleks. So, of course, it would make sense that the promo campaigns would cross at some point over there.
Yeah, definitely. And also the fact that the Beatles were quite busy at that time. It makes sense that maybe John wasn't all that excited about meeting a Dalek because they didn't really have time to become Doctor Who fans.
That's true. That's true.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the actors. We have a lot of actor crossovers between Beatles and Who, particularly Liverpudlians and Who. Toward the end of the most recent series, we had the companion Dan, who was a Liverpudlian.
Played by John Bishop, a big booster of the town. And in fact, his character Dan was a big booster of the town. We get introduced to him giving tours at Liverpool History Museum, even though he doesn't work there, which causes a few issues. Most of that season, Flux, is filmed in Liverpool. Ironically, about the same time Matt Reeves was filming The Batman. So if there was something that bad where the Doctor and Batman had to be on scene, it had to have been really difficult. We do get a lot of shots of Liverpool, including at one point where we see the Beatles statues.
Which is great because it's really been filmed in Cardiff since 2005, almost exclusively. All of what we saw in the Beatles episode just this week was not filmed anywhere near Abbey Road Studios.
That was definitely all in Cardiff.
I saw a really interesting before and after where they were showing the scene where they go up on the roof of Abbey Road EMI Studios in the recent episode and how they painted in London after the fact.
Other real-life Liverpudlians included the most famous Doctor. I mean, I think we can still say that. Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor. Paul McGann, eighth Doctor. Ken Dodd, who, of course, did radio with the Beatles and was someone that they associated with quite a bit.
Yeah, speaking of association, there was a fest for Beatles fans a few years ago, and a couple of the quarrymen, there was a conversation going up, and somebody brought up Paul McGann, and a couple of them said, "Oh, yeah, I know his cousin there. Oh, yeah." Apparently, the Quarrymen and the McGann family do actually have social interactions. So,
wow.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah, I thought it was cool.
Another Liverpudlian is Elizabeth Sladen, who is certainly amongst the best known of the companions from the now 60-year history of the series, Sarah Jane Smith. She would actually get her own spinoff. And one of her earliest roles was actually in the Jerry and the Pacemakers film, Ferry Across the Mersey.
That's so interesting. Can you see her? Can you find her?
There's a photo of her on the ferry.
Oh my God, that's great.
As far as crossovers go, we've had 3 different Doctors playing Beatles at one time or another. Chris Eccleston was in the BBC film Lennon Naked, which is an interesting film, by the way. I won't say it's good, but I won't say it's bad either.
Yeah.
I have it in my bottom films of all time.
Despite the presence of the sexy priest, huh?
Despite the presence of all of the quote-unquote sexy things, including Christopher Eccleston and his member, I just do not like that movie. But it's great to see one of our guys doing the crossover.
And bringing one of his own with him. The actress who played Yoko Ono on that was Naoko Mori, who gets introduced in a Christopher Eccleston episode of Doctor Who World War III as the character of Tohiko Sato, who ultimately becomes a regular on Torchwood.
Oh, she was great in Torchwood. She was actually quite good in Lennon Naked as well. But
yeah, that's good. That leads us to the next actor who also had a major role, Peter Capaldi, who plays George Harrison in that production.
I think his George is so fantastic. It's worth sitting through all of John and Yoko, A Love Story. Just the way he delivers Narc is lovely. Yeah, one of my favorites. Not the movie, just the portrayal.
Worst fake mustache ever. And then David Tennant, the 10th Doctor, appeared as George in a skit that was on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Not just a little skit. I mean, it was a good 10-minute skit.
That's true. And let's not forget the one actor who is sort of like the 0.43 if we're counting people who were both the Doctor and a Beatle. How much do we need to go in for the non-Whovians about Trial of a Time Lord?
It's a story that was in the 6th Doctor era.
Right. And there's a character that he's going up against who happens to be a future appearance of him, the Valyard. Now, at one point, the Valyard is disguising himself as a different character, Popowick. And of course, this being the 80s on BBC, they handled disguises by putting another actor in the role and then just trying to make it look like they transition. Said actor Popowick was Joffrey Hughes, who was the voice of Paul in Yellow Submarine, which gives him maybe a slightly better claim than some of the other actors here.
That is true. I mean, a lot of people did not know that those were not the Beatles for quite a while.
Other actors that you may know of.
Of course, there's Eleanor Braun, who everybody will probably remember as Ame from Help, who also had a great appearance in a classic episode with Tom Baker, City of Death. She's in a art gallery alongside John Cleese, looking at the TARDIS, thinking that it is a piece of art. And as they describe the form and such, they're both sitting there watching it as the Doctor goes in and whirls away, and she just goes, outstanding. Just outstanding.
One more. Sheridan Smith, who played Scylla in a 3-part British Scylla biopic. And she is known as the near-canon companion Lucy Miller, who appeared in a bunch of audios with 7 and 8.
For non-Who fans, there's an entire world of Doctor Who related material that's outside of just the television show, including a whole bunch of audio dramas from this company called Big Finish.
So in the other media, in the audios, which are for the most part really pretty fascinating stuff, a lot of them are full cast audio dramas. There is a couple of stories which are notably Beatles stories. So this is not the first time that we have a solid Beatles connection. Earlier in the show, we mentioned the very first episode of Doctor Who, An Unearthly Child, where they mentioned the Common Men as being one of those other acts from the 60s. The audio is entitled Fanfare for the Common Men, and one of the Doctor's companions wants to understand Beatlemania. Why did these girls go crazy for them? So the Doctor brings her to an airport reception, and who steps off the plane but 3 other guys in mop tops. What happened in this version of the timeline is that the draft was never canceled in the UK. So, well, come 1961, 1962, Paul, John, and George would all get called up, and there would be no Beatles.
It's an interesting point to think about. Talk a lot about alternate histories, and I'm not sure there's anybody else out there that I recall who's done any Beatle alt-hist that's actually brought that point up of military service. So kudos for them for coming up with a unique angle.
And here's an excerpt from the Big Finish audio drama, Fanfare for the Common Men.
Back in Hamburg, a lot of good groups broke up because of national service.
National service?
We all got out of it. Flat feet.
Bad eyesight.
Art student. Vital to the running of the country, apparently.
I wish my brother had got out of it.
Why?
Training accident. He never wanted to do it in the first place.
All right, love, I'm sorry. Look at all us sitting here laughing about getting out of it.
I'm glad you got out of it. Nobody should have to do it. I mean, what are we doing it for anyway? So we can go off and help the Yanks in Vietnam?
You said a lot of good groups in Hamburg broke up. What other groups were there?
The gaffer's giving us the nod.
Oh, what's the rush? We've not got a gig tonight.
Oh, he's probably set up an interview or a photo session or a recording session. Or he wants us to open a supermarket. I wonder if it would be possible to see you again.
Of course. Tickets. Least we can do. Look, here's a couple for the Royal Variety Monday night. Backstage too.
Can we talk then?
Sure.
Come on.
And thanks again.
The whole thing ends up being that you have some aliens who feed off of adulation. And so what's the best way for them to accomplish the most adulation? Oh, we'll just replace the Beatles.
Not wrong.
That is how the story moves through the 60s and the Beatle era. And well, I won't spoil the end if anyone really wants to find out, but this is very definitely a Beatles related story, possibly more of a Beatles related story than the one we got on television. And then on the novel side, there was a novel with the 7th Doctor called The Left-Handed Hummingbird. And one of the things about this story is that it strongly is involved with both the rooftop concert and, well, December 8th, 1980.
That is not the day that I would take my TARDIS to.
No.
Yeah. Again, more aliens playing around with our history.
Yes.
But it is fun to have them report that time-traveling Beatles suddenly show up on the roof of 3 Savile Row in the 202X.
And there were a couple of comics, too. Both of them involve the 10th Doctor, which I'm sorry for David Tennant. David Tennant himself is probably one of the biggest Beatles fans I can think of as a famous person. There are these montages of him and various Beatles t-shirts that he has. He must have like 14 of them. He's introed a special for the BBC about the Beatles, calling them the Shakespeare of our generation, things like that. He's just really into them. So the real 10th Doctor missed out on these, but in the Doctor Who comic Signs of Life, the 10th Doctor takes his companion Martha, who's also a real person from the canon TV show, to see the Beatles at the Cavern. And then in the Doctor Who magazine series, The Time of My Life, the 10th Doctor and Donna, whom we just saw again in the 3 specials right before the season, they also go to see the Beatles at the Cavern as part of a multi-part comic series. And Donna asks John to sign her 1 CD and also yells out from the audience to Paul to not marry Heather Mills. So that's very Donna.
Did either of the stories refer back to each other and one of the Beatles go, hey, who's the bird you're with? He's not the same one that you had the last time.
No, they didn't mention that.
Must have been a different night at the Cavern.
Admittedly, they had like how many appearances there, so they could have easily lost count.
And in the series, they actually made mention of the fact that on the first night at the Cavern, half or 90% of the audience was time travelers.
Oh, yes.
I can see that.
One more little bit before we get into the episode. Again, real world. Jim found some really interesting stuff about the real life connections between some of the folks behind Doctor Who and behind the Beatles.
Yes.
How was Brian related to some of the folks behind Doctor Who?
Well, there are pictures I think we can share which show Brian Epstein with Verity Lambert, the woman who ultimately takes Sidney Newman's idea for a time travel show and gives us the Doctor Who that we all know and love now. But the fact that the two of them actually knew each other socially on some cosmic level, from the very beginning, you had this connection that was going between them. That's a connection no writer could have ever come up with on their own.
The other connection, which I really find just the tiniest bit spooky, before George Martin encountered the Beatles, he did a record called Time Beat under the name Ray Cathode. You can find it on the George Martin collections. And he came about to making this record because he was working with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
That's a totally crazy coincidence because the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was this pioneering experimental studio that created electronic music and naturescapes, and most importantly to this podcast, music that conveyed futuristic or extraterrestrial worlds. The theme music for Doctor Who and the iconic sound of the TARDIS landing were both created in that studio.
There's some rather priceless pictures of George Martin, aka Ray Cathode, hanging out with some of the oscilloscopes and various other electronic instruments at the BBC. They have placed a sombrero on the head of what really looks like a server to us these days.
It's probably some of the same equipment Delia Derbyshire would use in order to arrange the Doctor Who theme and, in fact, actually compose it, now that the scholarship has indicated that she had a much bigger hand in it than originally it assumed. Derbyshire also is an interesting connection in that she had a group of electronic musicians called Unit Delta Plus that appeared at the London Roundhouse on the same night Carnival of Light premiered. So 2 people in the same area that you wouldn't expect otherwise.
Paul McCartney actually went to Delia Derbyshire to do an electronic version of Yesterday.
I can't imagine, though, what that would have sounded like. Yesterday, 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 yesterday.
I think you can imagine exactly what it sounds like, and it's just that. This was actually Paul's first introduction to avant-garde music, even before John. Mm-hmm. That is thanks to Doctor Who that he was the first Beatle really to get involved.
I guess it's just about time to start talking about the episode itself. As we had mentioned earlier, Russell T Davies, the showrunner of Doctor Who, did a lengthy interview in Empire magazine, and what he says is that he'd always wanted to do a Beatles episode, but he'd always hit a certain stumbling block. Mm-hmm. I knew instantly you can never play Beatles songs on screen because the copyright is too expensive. We know that Mad Men paid $250,000 to play Tomorrow Never Knows in one episode.
$300,000 for both sync and master, which actually was a bargain because a few years later, when Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny uses Magical Mystery Tour in a scene. All rights totaled together when it was finished came to about $1 million.
So even with that Disney Plus money, that's just not going to be happening right now.
You would think that after Get Back that the Beatles would have been the house band of Disney Plus. Not quite, no.
So continuing, Davies says, how would you do a Beatles episode without Beatles music? And that became the entire plot. That's where the idea came from, copyright law. It also came from a conversation that proved to Davies that the legacy of the Beatles still has meaning for younger generations. There's a young director called Sam Arbor, who I've been kind of mentoring for a while. And when I told him I was going back to Doctor Who, at that point he was just 21 years old, and he said to me, oh my, if I had a TARDIS, I'd go back and watch the Beatles recording their first album. And I thought for a 21-year-old to say that must mean there's something to that idea, which is interesting. I wouldn't have thought that Please Please Me is where someone of that age would choose to go.
You know, there's so much magic about that time period. The idea of possibility, being on the cusp of stardom, making an album in one day. I think there's just so much myth and mystery involved in that. And, you know, we've seen so much of later years of the Beatles. So I think that that might be a reason that you can't see it. We'll never know what it was like. And we do kind of know what it was like to film Get Back. So maybe if I had my TARDIS, I'd be going to the earlier days too.
Yeah, mind you, they'd probably have to beat everybody off with a stick. We were talking about earlier when one of the stories mentioned that half the people in the first night in the cavern were time travelers. That seems a little low to me.
You search around on the internet, there is actually a time traveler's guide to the Beatles history. It's like, you can go on this day. The first set in Hamburg, the second set in Hamburg, the third set in Hamburg. This day at the cavern you can go to.
That's just too much bureaucracy for me for time travel. I don't think I can do it. But anyway, going back to that quote, not only was Russell T Davies inspired by his 21-year-old friend who said this, he basically put those words into companion Ruby Sunday's mouth, who's only supposed to be about 18 or 19.
I want to see the Beatles recording their very first album.
Seriously?
Well, you asked if I could go anywhere in time and space. That's where I'd go because my mum, she had a girlfriend, Claire, and we loved Claire, and she was dead into vinyl. She had all the Beatles albums, so we used to play them every day after school. 10 years old I was. We had Revolver, the White Album. So yeah, if I could go anywhere, then that's where I'd go.
And the Doctor is so excited. He's like, why have I never done that before? The story starts off with a bang. Bang, we are into the Beatles. We are into the fashion. They set their TARDIS for February 11th, 1963, and off they go.
Thankfully, they were going back to a time that was very forgiving, considering that they were dressing closer for what it would be if they were recording Rubber Soul or Sgt. Pepper, because they did not have suits and boots like that in 1963.
Yeah, this is one of the first of so many anachronisms in this episode. The fact that there are anachronisms, that's going to happen. That's always going to happen. But the fact that they were so very specific with certain things, very unspecific with others.
And I will say that the Doctor's suit, he does indeed look like Billy Preston circa, maybe not Get Back, but maybe circa 66, 67.
Yeah, he looks amazing. His companion, Ruby, looks amazing. They show up in front of not the 1963 Abbey Road Studios, in that the 28 IF White Beetle is parked right there in the same spot we see it on the cover of Abbey Road. Another little anachronism, which I think they do just to give non-fans the feeling of the era, the feeling of the Beatles, rather than 100% historical accuracy.
Also remember the fact that you've got the Doctor Who audience who may not be as familiar with all of the elements of the Beatles' history. So gearing it in order to bring them in a little bit, I can see being perfectly happy with that. I mean, if it makes people ask questions and say, oh, what more can you tell me? I'm all for expanding out everybody's interests that way and helping them along.
I didn't mind it so much. Also, if I had my pick of all of time and space for fashion, I might go a few years later in the 60s too, just because you're going to look so good. Despite the not so accurate things right there, there was an extremely accurate moment in that they changed out the sign of Abbey Road Studios. When they see it, they walk in, it says EMI. It's the original EMI sign that was up before they renamed it Abbey Road Studios. I kind of squealed a little bit because that level of nerd accuracy on the Beatles side, well, that was the first time we saw it, and I was thrilled.
And they actually make a point of it in a line of dialogue.
Abbey Road Studios! Not called Abbey Road yet. Right now, in 63, they are the EMI Recording Studios.
That was kind of the function of Doctor Who originally, was to educate the youngsters. There still has been a bit of a mission to educate people on things they don't necessarily know. I mean, even through the modern era, we've had a Shakespeare episode, we've had Vincent van Gogh episode.
They do actually do that with the Beatles here, as well as a number of other things. There was a nice shout out about nuclear winter that went in there too. So yeah, there's plenty of ways to educate people without necessarily shoving a book under their noses. That's all you got, a sticky book.
A bloomin' book. So the Doctor and his companion do indeed go into Abbey Road Studios, and they are accompanied by a 1967 song, Oops. They are in the hallway at Abbey Road, and they got the photos right. They actually went and matched up to genuine period photos of what the outer part of Abbey Road Studios look like.
I gotta admit, the set dressing, they did a really great job of getting the inside of all the different studios down pat.
Except Studio 2. They didn't have the money to build upstairs.
Also, the Doctor had to break through the glass to get his Sonic.
Well, okay, admittedly. The show asks for a lot of gimmies, and I think because it's allowing people to introduce the Beatles, we'll give them a few more than we might normally give an episode of Doctor Who.
One of the first Beatles people we see is George Martin, and oh boy, he is a good lookalike for George Martin.
He's so good, and he sounds right. His mannerisms are right. I loved it.
All right, let's take it from the top. I thought the chorus, don't slide in the harmonies, just hit it.
Whatever you say, boss.
He is a somewhat more worn down George Martin than we might expect for this day.
And I think that's a sign of things to come, of what this version of 1963 is like now that music has changed for the worst.
The four actors who are playing the Beatles, not great lookalikes?
No, there was a lot of confusion and annoyance when some of the stills came out a few weeks ago. And in fact, a lot of people were saying the only acceptable way this is a thing is that if the storyline is somehow based around some kind of body swapping thing where the Beatles aren't the Beatles anymore. That wasn't the case, but it just was the case that the actors weren't terribly similar to the Beatles.
I will give the Paul a bit more credit than other people do. John is wearing the National Health specs.
Yes.
And I mean, again, that's a case of how do people recognize John Lennon? People recognize John Lennon because of the little round glasses. And
right.
Okay.
And that's why they did that. I didn't begrudge them that. The fact that Paul McCartney has piercing blue eyes kind of got me, though. That's not a thing that Paul McCartney has.
And we don't get more than about 20 seconds of George and Ringo.
I know. And they sound like they're pretty spot on. And that little banter that they have when they just first moved from George Martin over to the Beatles, it's quite good. It sounds right.
Boys, do you want anything?
I'm all right for now. Maybe something stronger later on. What do you think, John?
Now you're talking, Paul, lad.
I just want a good night's sleep.
You keep playing like that, we'll all have a good kip.
It sounds right until they start playing the song.
The Doctor and Ruby look over. It's like, ooh, what are we going to see? What are they going to start on? And, well, they start on a song about a dog named Fred.
And a 3, 2, 1.
I've got a dog, he's called Fred. My dog is alive, he's not dead. I love my dog, he loves me too. I haven't got a cat, only a dog. My dog, my dog, my dog, my dog. I've got a dog, I love my dog. He's my dog, he's not your dog. If you want a dog, get your own.
He's alive, he's not dead.
As I said to Erika, the unfortunate thing is it kind of sounds like a bad Paul McCartney song. Let's make a worse version of Freedom, you'll get this song.
Yeah. Thing is, though, I watched the episode a couple of times. That song's a bit of an earworm.
Well, that actually says something, because if a terrible song from the Beatles in a terrible universe is memorable years later, then aren't they technically still the Beatles then, if they've managed to accomplish that?
As we discovered throughout the course of this episode, yeah, they are.
Yes.
The Doctor and the companion don't quite know what's going on, so it's like, okay, well, let's go off into some of the other studios. They make a brief stop off in Studio 3, and the orchestra has no idea what they're doing.
I've heard better versions of Three Blind Mice on Two Gazoos than what they gave us there.
It was dissonant and sad.
I don't know if either of you noticed this or not as the show went on, but this was a world where music had been taken from them. Does that kind of remind you of another property from years ago? Like, say, Yellow Submarine?
I really liked this theory, and the first place I heard it was from you, so I think you should elaborate just a bit.
First off, I can't take full credit. This was provided by another correspondent I had, but the fact is that we had a land where music had been taken from the universe by the maestro. And here comes the Doctor to try and help bring music back to the land. And one of the things that helps them do that is finding Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in order to help them get back to singing, which, considering the Beatles are Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it kind of tracks there in terms of how much of the film they were doing homage to.
Considering how many small things and kind of background things they got so right, I can absolutely see that influencing this plot.
I think it was an influence, but I don't know how much of one. It also may have been that Russell was just kind of thinking about things, but what I will say is a scene we're going to get to is very definitely influenced by a scene in Yellow Submarine.
Yes, but before we get there, let's go to the third recording, or really it was the second recording that they saw of 3. They pop in on Cilla Black in another studio, which obviously never happened because at that point Cilla was still in Liverpool, hadn't even auditioned for Brian yet. But she was part of the episode, which personally I loved. We just did a Cilla episode 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I think probably because Russell T Davies is so committed to representation. EMI at that time was kind of a sausage factory, and the only women you probably saw were cafeteria people and cleaning people. And so to have Cilla in there, you're seeing a woman in the music making part, which you wouldn't see otherwise.
They should have brought Sheridan Smith back for that.
But that woman who played Cilla was from Liverpool, and she is a redhead. She was very happy to be Cilla.
I mean, we're talking earlier about introducing people to historic figures. There's a lot of Americans who probably don't know who she is, and I'm hoping that at least 1% of them, which means tens of thousands, are probably going to say, oh, she sounds interesting. Let's see if I can find more of her music and get her profile back up there.
And I would bet that there are a lot of Brits, too, who were born maybe after 1980, who knew Cilla from Surprise, Surprise and Blind Date, and really didn't connect her with this illustrious history with the Beatles. The Doctor and Ruby are hopeful that Cilla will be the powerhouse singer that she was in real life, and not a sad shadow of herself like they found with the Beatles, but they're sorely disappointed. Her song is even worse.
The Doctor very clearly realizes that something is wrong, and so they're going to go figure out what happened.
At which point, each one takes a songwriting beetle. The Doctor talks to Paul.
Excuse me, hold on, Paul. Could I just have a word? I've got a cup of tea for you. Mr. Epstein sent me. You are writing songs for the band, yeah?
They're not very good, are they?
Oh, no.
That's great, lad. That's how it should be. It's not like the old days when we had waltzes and fandangos and all that.
But waltzes used to exist. When did they start becoming wrong?
Dunno, way back. 20s, 30s.
Why? What happened?
We started seeing sense. What we're doing here today is the last gasp. If I can make a bit of money out of cheap old rhymes so I can settle down and get a proper job. It's embarrassing, singing.
Ruby talks to John.
Finish the album, get back to Liverpool, and forget it.
Well, you can't do that. We need you.
What for? I'm no good at anything.
He comes out the idea that there really is no love for music, not just personally, but culturally.
The Doctor tries to find the innate love of music that must be hiding inside them. And for just a moment, Paul opens up to describe the wonder of music that he knows is out there but isn't able to grasp.
But Paul, see, when it's just you on your own, don't you think that there must be better songs? Or songs that lift you and devastate you and make you soar. Songs that are tucked away somewhere in secret in the back of your mind.
How do you know that? It's like sometimes, late at night, I get this thought. Like, it's so far away, but it's a note. A single note. And then a second, and a third, and fourth, and fifth. And you put them together, and it feels like the most holy thing on this earth.
But Paul's declaration of his love for music incites the villain to rear their head. This villain is called the Maestro, and they've sucked all love for music from the world, creating a society that is sad and hopeless. This villain is played to perfection by Jinkx Monsoon. Jinkx is a two-time winner of RuPaul's Drag Race, most recently winning the title of Queen of All Queens in Drag Race All-Stars. She's also a theater performer, currently finishing up a run as Audrey in Little Shop of Horrors off-Broadway, and will soon return to the role of Mama Morton in Chicago. We talk a lot more about Jinkx, the Maestro, and the sci-fi part of this episode on the When They Was Fab version. So head over there if you want the deep dive.
Maestro shows up and starts bonking people, shall we say, the way they start rejecting music. That's a very telling moment right there in terms of what has happened to the world. And they do go on for a couple minutes after that to see how sad a place that is. And I don't even think they capture half of how bleak and desperate a world like that would be.
One thing they did very well was you could see the despair and sadness in John's and Paul's demeanors and their eyes, and how they had this inside of them, but they were just incapable of expressing it.
There's scenes in Yellow Submarine where people try and smile but get bonked. And in many ways, the way that they're forced to get out of feeling musically inclined reminded me of the bonkers coming around and keeping people from getting all that happy.
Yeah. And one more historical accuracy note, the Doctor, to try and lure Paul to talk to him, gives him a cup of tea and says, Mr. Epstein sent me. Didn't need to be there. It was lovely that it was. Just to show you how little people do know about some of this history, I read a post today that said, did they just mention Jeffrey Epstein on the Beatles episode? So I'm glad they're adding these real historical things, because somebody, of course, replied, no, you idiot, it's Brian Epstein's Beatles manager. Of course not.
I'd say the Jeffrey Epstein thing, hopefully that person was kidding, but...
I hope so, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
Now, other than the end, this is kind of more or less the end of the Beatles part.
Well, considering that they've got this all-powerful extra-dimensional being that's chasing them, yeah, they're not going to be thinking about the Beatles that much. They're running for their lives.
Yeah, this is a being that the Doctor is uncharacteristically afraid of and just doesn't have very much in his toolkit about how to fight them.
Yeah. This was definitely one of the good, creepier characters to have. Something that you're going to remember to say, oh, man, that scared me when I was young. And I was 36 at the time.
In order to try and figure out what's going on, they take a piano on the roof. That has to be a Get Back reference.
Yes, absolutely.
And so because Ruby is the only one who still has music in her soul, he has her play.
Yes, and he affects a number of people positively, including a nice Easter egg back to the Tom Baker era. The woman who gets influenced in order to try and play some music herself was the same person in the costuming department who was in charge of getting a scarf for Tom Baker, and said, well, this is the pattern. Well, why is it so long? You didn't tell me when to stop. And so as a result, Tom Baker's got 20 feet of wool wrapped around his neck for 6 out of 7 years.
She deserves to get killed by a master Doctor Who villain for that.
That is a great honor to have her come in as such an important player. Yes, I agree with you.
Adorable.
I don't know if it's supposed to be an old folks' home or if it's just supposed to be an apartment complex across the way, but it is very much dark and gray. And this is the scene I was referring to earlier. It is definitely an homage to the Eleanor Rigby sequence in Yellow Submarine. Ruby playing the piano once again calls back the maestro.
And then the new chase begins, and they have to figure out how they're going to deal with this threat. Ultimately, having to go to battle with this creature. This was something I noticed in the second watching. When it comes to the final fight, the maestro's there, you notice that they've got braiding on the jacket, very much like the braiding on the Sgt. Pepper uniforms.
Oh, yeah, I noticed that too.
I'm just waiting for the time when we get 4 guys showing up at a science fiction convention, all dressed as the maestro, but in Sgt. Pepper colors.
I'm here for that.
John Lennon had that jacket in those photos that he shows up where Paul's got the red jacket on and they have Martha with them. It looks almost like a duplicate of that coat.
Again, the attention to detail when they attended to detail was outstanding.
And the one piece of information which comes out of this is that the maestro came into this universe via Chord, and that there is probably a Chord which is going to banish her from this universe.
I'm just going to accept that and move on with it.
Every time Superman had to deal with somebody from the 5th dimension, it was a little trick like that. Sure. Hey, let's use it here again, too.
It got us out of it. Got us to the next stop on our journey, so.
Yes.
So they do indeed show up back in 1963, as does the maestro, who captures Ruby, and the Doctor has to find a way to make things happen. The Doctor picks up John Lennon's J160E. Very nice touch.
Oh, John Lennon's guitar. Let's go get this started.
Amongst them, he goes into Studio 2, and he, crashes through the glass.
He tried to get a resonance through the sonic, which gets frustrated, so he has to go to the music battle, which has the Mrs. Mills piano versus the violin.
Of course, the Mrs. Mills piano is a legendary instrument at Abbey Road. This piano has a distinctive sound that evokes an old-time saloon, and it appears on many Beatles songs, as the Doctor explains here.
This is the famous Abbey Road piano. They call it the Mrs. Mills piano. Oh, she was a girl. We had some adventures, me and Mrs. Mills. But this is the piano that the Beatles will play on their greatest hits. Penny Lane, Lady Madonna, all from this. So I know that this piano is rattling with all the potential to send you back to hell.
They do indeed get into a music battle. We discover that Mrs. Mills existed in this universe and that her piano is still there in EMI Studios, and that the Doctor name checks the songs which will be played on it.
Also, the fact that the Doctor mentions that they knew Mrs. Mills.
He had great times with Mrs. Mills.
Yes.
I love those moments in Doctor Who where the Doctor just ones off his marriage to the Queen or whatever he says.
Dr. Ted's coat being loaned to him by Janis Joplin, for example.
Right.
That's a story I want to see too sometime.
Yep.
The battle ends with the Doctor. As we have learned, he knows that there is a chord sequence which will send the maestro back into Never Never Land. And, of course, the Doctor is a genius, and he gets all the way to the last chord.
No!
And unfortunately, it doesn't work out. And so Maestro says, "You may be smart, but you're no genius," and then starts locking him inside the bass drum while the piano gets shoved out. And who should find the piano? But, of course, the two geniuses who are on site. The fact that you've got the Beatles people who there say, "Oh, they're going to save the universe. I feel vindicated."
And then a second, and a third, and fourth, and fifth. And you put them together, and it feels like the most holy thing on this earth.
That is the yeah moment. That's the reason why Beatles people are going to like this episode.
Yes.
Yeah, and even better, you start with John, and he seems so sad, but then you just see Paul coming in, and then together they make it happen.
And that requires a little bit of a gimme because they figure it out by looking at the notes that were suspended above the piano and then working it out just by looking at it, which is pretty impressive for two gentlemen who never learned notation.
If they really wanted to make it a Beatles thing, they should have had George Martin come up and start shouting out the notes.
That's a great fix.
I also thought there was a missed opportunity in what the chord was, which I think it was like a C major. It was something very simple.
Right.
Why didn't we hear the last chord of A Day in the Life? Or why didn't we hear the first chord of A Hard Day's Night? Something that's so Beatles.
John and Paul do indeed figure out the missing chord. They play it, and Maestro gets sucked away, at least for now. We've heard that she may be back.
I don't think this is the end of Maestro.
A villain that popular? No way.
Hell no.
And so music is now restored to the universe, and we go into a musical number, an original musical number. There's always a twist in the end.
There's always a twist, there's always a twist, there's always a twist at the end.
If they couldn't or wouldn't pay for Beatles music, they really should have gone for Twist and Shout here.
That still would have been a bit much. And to be honest with you, the lyrics of There's Always a Twist at the End do tie in well with the episode. And to some extent, the fact that it seems so over the top. What was your feelings the first time you ever heard the song It's All Too Much, which also closed out Yellow Submarine?
But I just found this a little bit too Broadway for my taste.
You know, it reminded me of those. Did you see the Elton John biopic Rocket Man?
Yes.
It reminded me very much of that, where all of a sudden there was a full dance musical number inserted into something with a more realistic tone. And even though we have the Maestro in science fiction, obviously this was a more realistic episode. It was historical. And even to me, a huge Glee fan, I live on musicals, even I was a little bit like, what?
We get a full dance number. Ruby goes and finds a bunch of other young people who are suddenly now wearing 1965, 1966 era clothes. And all right.
One reason why I don't mind it is that this new Doctor is electric when he's singing and dancing.
Yes.
So they're using his talents to the max. What I could not abide, though, was George Martin's performance in this number. George Martin twisting like an absolute maniac in the control room while the Beatles were playing. That is completely historically inaccurate, and I object.
Well, I mean, there are some hills that are worth dying on. I'm not sure that's one of them.
All right, and that takes us to the end of the episode. I mean, I think you know from what we've said in our review here, we're all really glad that we finally got a Beatles and Doctor Who episode. Quick review from each of us. I liked it because of the Beatles stuff. I liked the accuracy they got in the Beatles stuff. As a Doctor Who story, I don't like it quite so much. I still will give it a B or a B minus, but it could have been much better.
For what it was a great introduction, second episode of a new season, new Doctor. I think we got to see a lot of these new characters' strengths. Loved the villain, loved seeing the Beatles, loved the historical accuracy. Wish that they had focused on a few more things that would have made it more historically accurate, like making the Beatles look like the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And had they done that, I think it would have been pretty much a home run for me, but that certainly knocks it down a couple of points.
As I was saying earlier, I'm of two camps. As a Beatles person, it definitely was nice to see a certain amount of reverence done. And there was certainly maybe a lot deeper going in for it than they might otherwise have in terms of thematic elements. Yes, they got a few of the minor details wrong, but the general spirit was there. As a Doctor Who episode, it was definitely one of the lighter ones, although they introduced a great villain who apparently is part of the overall arc for this season. I would look back on this very fondly as one of the fun episodes. I mean, occasionally you're going to get an episode of your favorite show that doesn't quite work. I mean, no matter what you think about it, it's nice to have on and be able to enjoy.
For Beatles people, I think they definitely should watch it, even though they might not understand a lot of it. You know, you'll get enough of the general story. It's like, oh, okay, well, and that's kind of fun.
If you're a little nervous to go into something with 60 years of history, it's kind of a reboot of the reboot. New Doctor, the showrunner from the original reboot in 2005 is back. It's easy to follow on the science fiction side of it. So it's a good way to start watching Doctor Who, too.
Well, I'm sure both your listeners and ours will be glad that we're not going to talk that much Doctor Who until we have another reason to in the future, Erika.
Yes, but I'm glad that we finally had the chance to indulge.
Hear, hear.
was so much fun. That was fun for me. I've been a Doctor Who fan for many years, and it was great to have some like-minded folks on the pod to talk about this. But Allison, you are no Doctor Who fan, but you did watch the show.
I did, yeah.
As a first-timer,
As a
Doctor
novice.
Who. Yeah, as a novice, as a non-Doctor Who fan. What did you think?
I mean, I tried so hard because I was huge into Sherlock. I loved Sherlock. So back in those days, like 10 years ago when Sherlock was airing, it was sort of like Sherlock and Doctor Who went hand in glove with each other. And so I was like, okay, I've got to become a Doctor Who fan. So I watched, I think, most of the Eccleston episodes, who, you know, as you all know now, I'm sure has a massive history with also being John Lennon.
We've talked about him before on this podcast.
Oh, yes, we have definitely talked about Mr. Eccleston and the significance of his John Lennon role.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I have a, you know, a sort of rudimentary understanding of Doctor Who. Like I know what a Dalek is. Yeah, I know what that is. So yeah, no, I thought the episode was cute. The biggest misgiving I had with it was the discrepancy in the costumes. They seem so much more appropriate for the late 60s rather than 1963.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I was very impressed with the fact that, for example, they named by name the Mrs. Mills piano. Like, what the hell?
Right.
And yeah, and the EMI studios. And they went to such great lengths to be like, it wasn't called Abbey Road Studios yet. It was called EMI. And I'm like, what? Like, you guys are getting that specific and in the weeds, but yet you're wearing that for 1963.
Yeah. I mean, I think I know why they did it. I think that they were thinking that this was a group of people who they just need to get like the vibe of the Beatles. And by putting in things that people associate as Beatles things, and they're probably thinking like the more mod fashions are associated. John Lennon wearing his national health glasses is associated with John, and it picks him out among four guys who don't actually look like the Beatles. That's helpful. And
yeah, for sure.
Like, so little things like that. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but when they're on Abbey Road, the 28IF Beetle, like the Volkswagen Beetle, is out there.
Does it have the plate?
I don't know if it has the plates. You can't really see that closely.
Okay,
but
I noticed the Beetle, yeah.
So, you know, that probably wasn't parked there in 1963 either, but people will be able to picture this. Yeah, so I think those things were there to just give like a feel for the 60s. I think the same thing for Scylla, really, because like we talked about in the episode, Scylla was still back in Liverpool at this point when the Beatles were recording Please Please Me. She was not there. But EMI is full of dudes. And so putting Scylla in there at least gives some female representation. And it, you know, there's a better feel of probably what people think of as like the swinging 60s by having somebody like her there too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I would just love to have been in those meetings where they discuss, you know, oh, we're going to have 63 John Lennon wearing the granny glasses, you know?
Right.
And that logic. But, you know, but yeah, it was cute. It did give the essence of the time, I guess, and the Beatles. And it was a cute story. I thought Jinkx Monsoon was great. And
oh my God, so good.
I enjoyed the musical number as well. That was great.
Wait, which one? The end or the I've Got a Dog song? Okay, not the I've Got a Dog.
Yeah, not the I've Got a Dog was pretty lame, but I like the the end.
Well, I'm glad you watched it. I think that my biggest issue was why did they look like that?
Yeah. I think a lot of people had that issue, at least, you know, from where I stand on my side of the Doctor Who world. Like that's a lot of what I saw. From the Beatle people.
Mm-hmm. In a country full of people who probably try real hard to look like the Beatles a lot. I don't know. I don't get it. I didn't understand it. I mean, maybe it was someone's cousin. I don't get it.
Someone's cousin.
Paul does not have piercing blue eyes. He just doesn't.
No, that was disturbing. I mean, that was almost as like crazy jarring as John and his glasses.
Yeah. Why? Like Paul's eyes are like a huge feature of Paul.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody knows he has hazel brown eyes. Come on, duh.
Yeah, we don't need to make him look like Elijah Wood or something. And
oh my God, he was so Elijah Wood.
It was so weird.
That was the vibe. It was Elijah Wood.
It was,
Oh my
'cause he was
God.
all like innocent, almost like elfish. And I know Lord of the Rings people, an elf is a different creature, but you know what I fucking mean.
I'm crying. That's so good. That's so true. It's so funny. Yeah, that guy was so not Paul. It was sad. It was sad. I mean, there's been some really train wrecks as Paul, but that one was the worst, I think.
It was just surprising. Like, I mean, I guess if you're not gonna look for somebody who looks like Paul, go big.
I
And
guess
they went big because he really didn't.
they went clear on the other side of the world for that one. Yeah.
I mean, he was very sweet and he was convincing in his role, but when it's Paul McCartney, they should look more like Paul McCartney.
Agreed. 100% seconded.
Well, anyway, thank you for indulging my Doctor Who thing. I'm so glad we got to do this episode.
Yeah, I'm glad you did too. I'm glad that it finally came to fruition after like literally 5 years of talking about it.
I know. And I'm glad we have a Doctor Who Beatles episode out in the world.
Yes. And thanks to Jim and Ed for joining Erika in that conversation.
Yes.
And again, we will link some goodies in the show notes for you guys if you want to find out more about Ed and Jim and their projects. And thank you for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating/review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. Remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com too. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.